Hello and welcome to Forward 50. We're really excited to present this session, which is on the future of digital learning. So what is digital and why does it apply to government? And more importantly, especially for this session, well, how does learning play into it? What do public servants need to know? What do your governments need to know in order to serve you effectively in a modern world in 2020 and beyond, and potentially out to Forward 50? Today, we've got a fantastic group of panelists that are coming together, and we're going to be discussing and diving into some of these issues. So first of all, we're really thrilled to have you here, and we're really excited to get going. Before we actually dive in, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. The Algonquin people have lived on this land since time immemorial, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to present in this territory. So I'm going to start off by welcoming our participants, and I'll allow them a bit of time to introduce themselves to you. Sorry, I'm also Chris Allison. I'm with the Canada School of Public Service and honored to be your host today. So first, we're going to ask Nitika to come on board.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nitika Agarwal. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Apolitical and a former UK public servant. We were suggested to offer one fun fact about ourselves. So here it is. When I'm not trying to develop 21st century learning for public servants, I like making online video tutorials so that people around the world can convene and do flash mobs.
Very cool. Thank you and welcome, Nitika. Our next panelist is Vernie. Welcome, Vernie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vernie Olivero. I'm a principal researcher on digital government at the Civil Service College in Singapore. My fun fact is that I created a web-based application to help me and my friends decide whether we were going to take on extra engagements outside of work.
Sounds highly useful, and I would like a subscription, please. No less than $12.99 a month. Thank you, Vernie. And Tay, I would like to ask you to join us.
Hi there, my name is Tay McLennan. I'm head of the Scottish Digital Academy, the Digital Directorate at Scottish Government. My fun fact is probably not quite as interesting as you guys, but my guilty pleasure is reading fitness and nutrition magazines and articles. I'm into fitness whilst also eating a large bar of chocolate or cake.
It's important to be balanced, right?
Very much so. Balanced lifestyle is what we're going for.
Excellent. And our final panelist for the day, David. Join us, David.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Eves. I co-founded the Civic Startup, and for the last several years have been teaching about digital transformation at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My fun fact is I have an unhealthy addiction to Crispy Crunch candy bars, which are only available in Canada, and so I may or may not have an army of friends who regularly ship them to me.
Good to know. Good to know. And the CBSA, the Border Services, will be on the lookout. All right, so we're going to have a lot of fun today. We've got some great folks and we've got some great topics. So the topics we'll be diving into today, and there's four. The first one is why digital and why now? What is digital learning and why on earth does it matter? Our second theme is going to be around the importance of digital skills and exactly what does this mean? When somebody says you need to be more digital, how should you take that? And what should you do if you want to actually kind of follow that path? Our third theme is approaches to digital learning and how this may have changed with COVID, with a global pandemic, and how this has shifted our own institutions, but also potentially the needs of our users and the needs of our learners. And then the fourth theme is the future of learning, where we're going to ask our panelists to cast their minds and their kind of questing consciousnesses into the future and imagine what might be happening. I'm not sure if we're ready for 50 years, but 15 years from now, and where we might end up. The last thing we'll add is we want to keep this interesting. So there's going to be a lot of ideas that are generally accepted here. We're not going to have folks kind of going over and saying, yes, I agree, and this is what my organization's doing. Instead, you're going to see this when I find my fingers. And this hand wave or finger wave is basically saying, yes, we agree. So you can know when the panelists are agreeing with each other. And we're going to ask folks to hold their real energy for disagreements, not violent ones, but constructive and interesting disagreements or major additions. So with that, we're going to kick right off into the panel. So the first one our theme one, why digital and why now? So I'm going to start off and I'm going to ask Nitika, and then from there, we'll just open it up to the floor. But why digital? Why now? What does this mean to you? And as I'm going to throw out a kind of a little bit of a statement at the start of each theme as well. And the statement here is, well, Nitika, because of COVID-19, isn't everyone already digital? We're all watching, we're all using these kinds of devices to interact with each other. Are we done? Are we digital?
So I think digital can be taken to mean two things, probably more. But one is in substance. So are we working remotely? Do we know how to digitize our government and services to citizens, which has certainly been accelerated by COVID? But then there's a whole practice element, which is, are we working in a user-centered way? Do we know, are we starting to prototype in the public sector? Are we working in the open? And all of these ways of working have typically been associated with digital ways of working. Now, I personally think that we should scrap the word digital because it has the risk of begging the question, well, aren't we all digital? Isn't it all done? Whereas in fact, the working practices, possibly the even more important part of working digitally, often get lost when you use the word digital. Digital is just business as usual. So we should just work to learning should just be focused on what's best for citizens. So I vote to scrap digital.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nitika. Vernie, what's your take on this?
So I think I would keep the word digital because there are at least three key areas in which I think we can continue to do better and we need to do better, right? One is the issue of tools. So I think people have, especially right now in the middle of the pandemic, have intensified their use of digital tools to learn, to work. We've seen increases in digital tools in healthcare. And obviously there are areas of improvement, right? So I think in those areas, there are opportunities for us to use those tools better. The second area is infrastructure. So that could be connectivity, it could be hardware, but there's certainly areas in which the word digital, I think, brings our attention to areas where we may lack sufficient advancement. So that could be government systems that continue to rely on outdated code bases, on outdated languages that have limited functionality, right? It could be issues of people not having internet access and wired access for home-based learning and working, or insufficient number of hardware, right? The third area is data. I think the word digital forces our attention on our ability or inability to use data to effectively tackle problems. So in the case of the COVID pandemic, it could be, are you using data effectively to reduce the interval between exposure and entry to a quarantine facility so as to limit the spread of the virus? Are you using data effectively to identify clusters backwards, right? So the word digital, I think, is so necessary because I don't think we're doing good, or at least there could be areas of improvement in using technology and data better.
Okay, so I find it interesting that you're focusing digital on data, and I've heard that before, but I'm not sure if that's kind of a widely accepted thing. David, what's your take on this? Like, how would you actually define, like, what is digital? Is it data? Is it something else?
Yeah, so I do think that the kind of data is, I don't think Vernie's saying this, but I do think data is kind of overly narrowly construed version. So I made like two thoughts on this. The first is, I'm engaged in a project with some of people on this call and many and faculty around the world. And one thing we talk about is, what are the skills that a public servant needs in a digital era? Because I think this kind of tries to bridge that gap. So much of what has been taught in the past has been kind of like e-governance, or like thinking about what is going to be needed in to be working digitally. And the reality is, we are already in a digital era where almost any work that you do is being guided or shaped by some technology that is kind of providing the work or shaping the work. And your ability to kind of understand that, maybe not in detail, but have at least some minimum understanding of that, is going to be critical for you to do your work effectively, to spot problems. So for me, the kind of, I get struggled because I'm like, we are going into a digital era. And so I agree with Nitika where, like, yes, it's no longer digital because it's everything, but there is like something different about this era from the era before. And I think the second part that I would say is, the people, I think, often separate two things that are going on, or don't separate two things that are going on. The first is, yes, there's this kind of digital infrastructure that now everything's going to sit upon. And we need to understand and focus and teach about that to some degree. I think various people need to understand various amounts of that. But then there's a whole set of new practices, management techniques that sit on top of that, that they enable or that they constrain. That has nothing to do with coding or nothing to do with data science, but there's just new ways of working that are enabled or acquired. And that people are also calling digital. And so there's these two things going on simultaneously, and we actually need to figure out how to teach people about both those things and separate them.
Okay, so that's some really interesting stuff in there to unpack, and I'm going to ask Tay to have a look at this. So how does this actually play out in the Scottish government? And so obviously you're part of the Digital Academy there. You're working towards bringing people towards digital skills, whatever that is. How's that played out, and where have you seen successes?
So we've always found it's difficult with the word digital because it's open to interpretation. We've never quite got a definition of what digital actually is. But for me, I would love to scrap the word digital, but I don't think we're ready to do that, and maybe just use the word transformation. But digital for me is all encompassing. And I think that there are two sides to it. There's the digital, the tech side, the digital, the platforms and the tools that we use. But just as important, if not more so, is that mindset to understand how we need to ensure that we're building and designing services that have the users in mind and at the heart of everything that we do. So these are the two key areas, but depending on what role people are in, depending on what they do within government, will depend on how they perceive digital. And one of the key challenges that we've had is enabling people to understand that digital applies to all. And I think that COVID-19 has brought that to the fore, as building that understanding that digital applies to everybody in their home life and at work and is needed by everybody, and that everybody needs to have that baseline of skills that David was talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tay. So we're going to wrap this round up, and we're going to go into theme 2. And this actually speaks to the importance of digital skills. So we've touched on some of what those things are. We've touched on the fact that there's technical skills, but there's also more of kind of a mindset or a culture associated with digital. So what skills matter? What are these skills? What do people need to learn? And for the statement that I'd like you to potentially chew on for this is, well, if we're in a digital age, shouldn't we just run government like Google? Like, shouldn't we just have a bunch of software engineers going and building the systems and services that people need? Would that not be a better thing? And this time we're gonna throw it to Vernie first.
So I don't think governments should be run like Google, if at all, or any private companies for that matter, because governments can't pick the customers they serve, right? We have to serve everybody. And there are responsibilities and rights that we have to recognize and protect as well. I think, and so on this issue though, I think the question is, what would it mean for a government to be digital to the core, like Google or Amazon or Apple, right? And here, my argument is that I don't think we can get away from training, from requiring public servants to pick up technical skills. We live in governments, or we work in governments where economists don't have to explain marginal utility or CAGR. We live and work in governments where psychologists don't have to explain bandwidth taxes. And yet we continue to have governments where engineers and data scientists have to explain what the mean square error of a model is, or what JSON files are, or what an API is, or the difference between, let's say, a virtual private network, a firewall, or data encryption. If we really, really want to attract the best talent to work in governments versus Google and Amazon, you cannot have a system where the hygiene factor for engineers and data scientists is so poor that they have to explain basic engineering and data science concepts, right? But on top of that, I think the reason why it's important for public servants to have basic coding skills, whether in Python or R for data science, or in basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for products, is because I think when you begin to work and use APIs and libraries and so on and so forth, you learn and imbibe the values of what it means to work in a collaborative and open way, what it means to use open source technologies. But you also get a sixth sense about what works and what doesn't work when someone asks for a product feature, right? One of the most problematic things that engineers and data scientists deal with is when higher ups ask for product features that actually create 10,000 other problems, right? Hence the joke that, you have 100 bugs in the code, you remove one or add one feature, and now you have 1,000 bugs in the code. right? Or if a vendor comes to you asking for, or when you have a vendor producing a product for you and they charge you $10,000 for this change, do you have a sixth sense about whether or not that is worth $10,000? Right? And I think unless you have technical skills, not excluding of course product management and agile and design, technical skills are really where I think governments are currently lacking and where we really need to sort of like up our games.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Vernie. Tay, what's your take on this? Should all public servants be coders?
I think we've acknowledged some time ago that all civil servants need a basic level of IT skills, and it should be the same for fundamental baseline level digital skills. I do think it is difficult to draw the line at where we think the minimum viable knowledge a public servant should have. However, what we should aim to do is to be able to offer a breadth of training at an awareness level that covers the fundamental digital skills that can allow a public sector employee to have a solid and consistent framework of digital skills to build on and that common understanding. So all public sector employees would have skills in like coding, agile methodology, user research, service-centered design, accessibility. They're all key digital skills that would equip a public servant with what they need to be responsive and deal with the pace of change and citizens' needs. Those skills can be built on if it's needed. So you still need the deep dive, deeper understanding of tech, or if that person wants to undertake a better understanding, then that option should be there. But so yes, I think coding there should be at least a basic level of understanding and awareness of what coding is. And coding is a really good example of a digital skill that if you have a basic grounding in it, it teaches you to look at things differently and to break problems down into much more manageable chunks. It's about logic, it's about problem solving, both of which, for instance, we know are key skills that are needed for now and the future. So it's looking at where we can get that technical skill set and develop the mindset at the same time.
Thank you. And so, David, you both kind of created your own startup, plus you've kind of been diving into this quite a lot. So when we're talking about affordances, when we're talking about the knowledge that public servants need to have, or the questions that they need to be able to ask, how would you define those? What questions do we need to be able to answer?
Yeah, so I think the first is, I disagree that every public servant needs to know how to code. I'm reminded of a great conference I was at once where we ran a spectrogram with a bunch of doctors, and the question was, can a nurse with a computer be as effective as a doctor? And all the doctors kind of stood no, and one doctor stood over and they kind of yes side. And then you go around and interview people, and they came to Burke, who helped found OpenMRS, which is an amazing open source project. And he said, listen, I don't know if I don't know if where I'm standing is right, but I do know that if we don't make the answer where I'm standing, we're never going to solve the global health crisis. And so I think if we say the only way that we're going to fix government is that every single person needs to learn how to code, that is such an incredibly high bar for us to try to hit that I just don't think it's viable. There's so many other skills. So one of the advantages I have sitting where I sit is I've taught it and I've observed the core, which is the required courses that a student has to take when they come to a public policy school. And you have to understand that you're competing. So if you say everybody has to learn how to code, just understand now that you're competing with ethics, you're competing with economics, you're competing with statistics, you're competing with like a whole range of things. And what we have to do is figure out what is the minimum knowledge. So I love this term. What's the minimum viable knowledge that a public servant needs to have? And I think that includes having to understand what is possible and what's not possible. And I think one of the great things that we're doing right now is we're thrashing about trying to figure out what is that. And I'm willing to be wrong, maybe that everybody has to learn how to code in order to acquire that minimum viable knowledge to understand what's possible, what's not possible. But I don't think that that's true. I actually think there's a lot of very successful people in the tech sector who don't know how to code, who've gone on to create companies and be product managers and to have all sorts of roles where they've understood the affordances of technology without actually knowing how to code per se, or have figured out how to do data science. So I think what we've got to wrestle with is what is that minimum viable set of skills. I think the other thing that's challenging for us is Tom Steinberg, who I'm doing this project with, just shared a paper with me where it used to be that the accrediting organization for public policy schools required you to learn some IT skills, broadly defined. And that actually they became so diffuse that they dropped that credit because no one could figure out what an IT skill was. And so I think the challenge we have right now is digital is becoming everything. And so we've got to figure out how do we bring that has turning into everything, how do we bring it into some minimum set of skills that we can put into a course or put into a classroom and teach people that isn't displacing all of the other critical knowledge they need to have as well. Because if the choice comes down between ethics and learning to code, I'm choosing ethics every time.
Why? I don't get that, but anyways. So thank you so much, David. So over to you, Nitika. Now you're seeing public servants from around the world on the Apolitical platform. What are they asking for? What are the top things that you're seeing public servants want in order to do their work better?
That's a great question, and actually segues really nicely on from what the other panelists have said. The way I think about the question of what is the minimum viable digital set of digital skills that a public servant needs starts first and foremost by looking at, well, acknowledging that public sector jobs and roles are extremely diverse across the public sector. And the way I would answer that question is, what are the set of skills that an individual needs to understand the full life cycle of the policy that they're working on? So for somebody who might be in a policy position, actually for them to understand the delivery of that policy, it may be necessary for them to have a basic literacy in what the online platform does or the online interactions of citizens with the government website, for example. But for somebody in that team actually delivering the policy, obviously they may need to code. And so this idea of civil service, public service skills needing to look across the life cycle of their policy is what I call, the skill set is operating across silos in a tech-enabled environment. And those skills include critical thinking. That is one of the most popular topics that people ask for. Communication in all of its forms, so writing, storytelling, persuasion, data literacy obviously is very popular, and so hard sort of more classic digital skills are very popular, but not actually more popular than a lot of the other things I mentioned around communication and critical thinking and problem framing. And that is because I think public servants, rightly so, should see their role as they sit in a certain point in the policy cycle, but they need to know enough about all of the other points in the policy cycle.
Thank you. And it's really interesting, just kind of the framing around. I think it's easy for us to devalue like the tremendous amount of knowledge and skill that's required to operate effectively inside a government and with other partners and across governments. So an interesting bit will be how we choose to apply the digital lens to this as we're moving forward. So we're going to wrap up this round and we're going to go on to theme 3, which is approaches to digital learning or learning in a virtual world. And the view for this is COVID. It is COVID-19. It is the fact that we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and instead of coming together in Ottawa for Forward 50, we are filming this from our homes with cats and dogs and people and everything all around us. You just can't see them. And so how has this environment shifted learning in organizations? And there's a few ways to look at this. Are we teaching digital instead of digital skills? Are we teaching skills digitally, or are we teaching digital skills in a digital way? And what does this mean to your organizations? And what do you think the organizations out there actually need to thrive and to succeed in this world? And the kind of controversial statement I'll throw out there is the folks that are actually able to learn and work digitally are probably the people that already had it pretty good. How are we going to make virtual learning actually work for people who might not have high-speed internet, who might not have the bandwidth to even participate in something like this? And where should governments be looking? So we're going to open it up with you, David.
Yeah, on that latter part, one of the things I keep telling my students is, you went into the pandemic with the digital tools you had, not the digital tools you wanted. And while you were, at least certainly I think for the first 6 months, you did not have the capacity to build new ones. Because you're just in crisis response, you had to work with what you had. And so I think a lot of governments, if they didn't have a broadband policy, creating one in the middle of the pandemic so they could get all the kids back into school virtually, that was a very high bar, like very, very hard to do, while also trying to do all of the other things, like deal with the teachers unions, deal with the principals, like figure out how we're going to do this, doing all that while also trying to do your broadband policy. It just proved to be, I think, too overwhelming for many, many actors. And so I think what it's really shown us is there's a whole bunch of foundational work that people have either assumed was maybe, kind of optional, that we now realize is no longer optional, and is, I think, refocusing people, which I think is very, very positive, and just sad that it didn't happen beforehand. I think on the learning side, the part that gets me most excited is that what the virtual learning is doing, and my colleague Matt Andrews, I think, is just like a real leader and pioneer in the space, and same with Marshall Gantz, is that, because they've been doing this before the pandemic, is that it allows us to teach people who are still in their jobs. And I think the pedagogical thing we need to be figuring out how to do, which I think they do really well, is how do you connect what you're teaching with what they're doing, so that you maybe stretch the teaching out, because we can't make people sit in Zoom for 8 hours a day. Maybe it's only 1 or 2 hours a day, or even like 3 hours a week. But then the pedagogy is much more linked to what they're doing and what they're working on, so they can change that and learn from those changes and bring those experiences back to the classroom, as opposed to pulling people out of their context, training them, and then hoping they go back and are able to apply it. And I think that puts a lot more pressure on faculty to figure out how to do that. But the value and impact you can have can be vastly greater as a result. I think this is everybody who's stuck in Zoom. I know that's not ideal, but there is something really exciting we can do if we can figure this out.
Okay. Thanks so much, David. Tay, what is your take on this? Where has our environment helped? Where is learning now better? But also, where are we falling behind, and where do you think we should be focusing next?
Well, we've successfully transitioned our learning online. So we've had lots of learns coming from a classroom environment. And it's not as simple as just replicating what you do online. So some of the key learns that we've had are around taking things back to basics, understanding what your users need, what environment they might be in, looking at accessibility, referring to the kind of design of the products and devices and the environment so that everyone can use it. But even becoming more aware of things like neurodiversity, where you've got lots of conditions encompassed and characterized by atypical ways of working, like dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and just making sure that people are more aware of the changes that need to be made that can make a huge difference in accessibility to learning, and also attracting talent. I would say that we've had lots of positive feedback from the interactive virtual learning experiences that we've had. But one of the big things that we've struggled with is around building relationships. So for the delivery of our courses, our coaches develop relationships with delegates and cohorts as soon as they step into a room for training. And sometimes these relationships have been built up over a period of time beforehand. Being able to build that relationship quickly at the start of a course is a key factor in ensuring the learners feel more comfortable to contribute to discussions, have their voices heard, share challenges, ask questions, and also build networks. That's quite difficult to do online when we've got shorter, more condensed courses. People need to stay engaged, and they can't do that for the time frame that they would have done previously in the classroom.
No, so those are some excellent points. And obviously, so this is one of the challenges Forward 50. We're facing it in the Canada School of Public Service as well. If you're doing an event, one of the reasons that people go to events and conferences is to meet people. And whether that's meet people they already know, who they don't have opportunities to catch up with all the time, or meet new people who are doing interesting things in this space. So you can hear David speak or hear Vernie speak and go up and talk to her afterwards. So how are we handling that in this kind of virtual era? Nitika, what is Apolitical doing to actually build community as a way to kind of support learning and support kind of those connections?
Social learning has always been a very clear way to make learning engaging. So it has been the secret sauce of a lot of in-person learning, and it's absolutely a challenge to figure out how to create that same interaction online. What we've been experimenting with online community building amongst policymakers for a really long time, and we have several models that we've evolved and adapted for this. The baseline is you can still create a classroom experience online, not because people are sitting for several hours in a Zoom room together, although that can be some interaction, but having online asynchronous channels for people to chat off the back of stimulus. So like if people are reading material together, having discussion questions where they can share their thoughts in their own time. And actually, we've been able to leverage the fact that we're doing this digitally, because what it's allowed us to do is get international participation. So already participants are getting to hear from colleagues that they would never even meet, actually, if it were in person. And then an opportunity for people to approach individuals directly through messaging. We've also found that on live events, use of the chat function has meant more people speak up and you hear more voices because the whole experience isn't dominated by those comfortable to speak. So that's one model, which has been quite effective at fostering connections and interaction. And then you can kind of take that through to more like longer fellowship kind of models where people have those sorts of interactions, but they're repeated. So it's the same cohort which meets over a period of time. And drawing on David's point, that can be incredibly powerful because people have the chance to actually do stuff between them meeting, and you can end up with more substance for people to share once they've met a few times and actually they're meeting a month later and they've had an assignment to do in the middle. And again, it's very hard to fly a bunch of international public servants around the world to have 3 in-person meetings. So while obviously there's nothing quite like meeting somebody in person, there are opportunities that digital presents where you can actually do things that would just be too costly to do in person. And I'll just end with a great quote that I heard from the head of Brazil's training school. He said, you look at digital options differently when they're your only option. And I think we've definitely been more imaginative in the use of digital since COVID.
Thank you so much. So Vernie, we're going to close with you and just have a minute to finish off this theme before we go on to the next one. But specific to the theme of accessibility, which we've seen come up a couple of times, what have you seen work well in trying to bring learning to people who might traditionally be left out? And is virtual actually, is it a force for inclusion, or is it something that is going to further marginalize people?
So I think it both excludes and includes depending on how you use it, right? I think one thing that's great about digital learning, for example, through webinars, is that you have much broader reach for people who might not be able to leave their homes. I've done some webinars where we've recorded and then broadcasted on Facebook Live or YouTube, and people who might not have been able to attend a conference at set amount of time can then visit the conference later and still learn from that panel, for example, right? I do think, and I especially like the point that we can learn internationally. I think this is a great thing, especially cuts down our carbon footprint. But I would say that the one thing that still limits international learning is actually the English language, right? Like the people who are best able to learn from conferences like this is actually your fluency with the English language. And that's not a digital thing, it's a problem with the internet. It's even a problem in programming, right? Lots of programming is actually English, uses English syntax. So it's actually very key to the inequality of the internet that fluency in English is so much a part of your accessibility experience.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Vernie. So we're going to go into theme 4, which is the future of learning. What will learning look like 15 years from now? We're short on time, so we're going to do this as a bit of a lightning round. So we're just going to go around one person at a time. We'll give you their views on this. The statement that I'll throw out there is that, well, eventually artificial intelligence is just going to replace knowledge workers anyway, or as I like to put it, I, for one, welcome our robotic overlords. So what's your take on this? What is the future if you cast forward 15 years? How do you think digital learning will shape our people? And if there's one thing that you think folks should know coming out of this conversation, what would it be? And we're going to start with Tay.
So I would say learning in the 15 years it's a big question to answer. I think so much can change in say 15 years. If we look back to 5 years ago when we had no Instagram, no smartphones, very slow broadband, then we know that things are moving at an incredible pace, and the skills needed to work effectively in the modern world today have developed dramatically already, and it's likely to move significantly faster as time goes on. Skills profiles also change. It's not good enough to be reactive or even proactive because we don't know what skills are needed. So we do need to have a learning methodology that can deliver skills whatever they are and whenever they're needed. And that means developing and instilling a lifelong learning culture. And it also means ensuring public sector employees have a solid grounding in digital skills and not just the technical skills, but the skills that I talked about previously in core digital skills. And we need to be multidisciplinary in order to have the fundamental skills in place to be able to adapt and build on those skills to meet the changing needs of the modern world. We need to stop skills in isolation and equip our public sector employees with the skills and the mindset they need across a multidisciplinary team and stop pigeonholing ourselves.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're running pretty short on time, so I'll ask my panelists to be brief and bold. David, over to you.
Yeah, maybe the first thing is I'd be remiss not to at least ask everybody to Google Teaching Public Service in the Digital Age, which is a project that many of us on the call have been on, where we've tried to distill out what we think are the core competencies that public servants need to have to be effective in a digital era. And I think the only thing I would say is, I don't know what's going to happen the next 15 years. I just think government's ability to adapt to learning in new ways has to move faster. So let's not predict, but let's create systems that can adapt and integrate new best practices more quickly.
Thank you, David. Okay, Vernie, over to you.
So I think the biggest question we should ask ourselves and we should take away from this is what enables you to take advantage of the opportunities of digital tech, right? It's not to be afraid of digital tech, but to also be able to use it. So for example, if you could think of as a public servant, whether you could use the new GPT-3 API to write and draft your policy papers and your speeches. Let's think about the opportunities of that. If you knew how to program, it would be fantastic, right? But yeah, how would you enable yourself and your people to take advantage of the opportunities? I think that's the big message.
Thanks so much, Vernie. And closing comments to you, Nitika.
I think currently 80% or something like that, the majority of learning that people do at work isn't actually formally recognized as learning, even though it is. Learning on the job, talking to their colleagues, Google searches, figuring out how to write something on YouTube. And it's not been recognized because it's not going through a central government system and they don't get a certificate at the end of it. My vision in 15 years' time is that that kind of learning is both measurable in meaningful ways and traceable, and that people get recognition for it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I'd like to give huge thanks to all of you. It's been a phenomenal chat. Really appreciate your time, your insight, and your experience that you bring here. And thank you to Forward 50. And folks, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.